It's time for video lesson number 9. Today we're going to be adding and subtracting fractions, your favorite. This is just a review of what you learned in 5th grade, so relax, should be quick. So for adding and subtracting fractions, of course, you're going to need your TOC number 9. It's yellow from your binder, and then you'll need a pencil or pen to take notes. It's always helpful to have a highlighter, marker, or colored pencil so you can circle things. And this is part of the non-calculator section, so don't get those out and cheat. All right, so let's review some vocabulary. First and foremost, let's talk about improper fractions. These are your top-heavy fractions. That means the numerator or top number is larger than the denominator. We don't like those, so we turn them into mixed numbers. This is a number that contains a whole number and a fraction. And so we take improper fractions, we turn them into mixed numbers, but then sometimes we have to turn mixed numbers into improper fractions, especially later on when we have to multiply and divide. So that's important that you know those terms. And of course, there's the common denominator. When we're adding and subtracting fractions and mixed numbers, we have to have fractions that have the same bottom number or the same denominator, which is the same number on the bottom. So how do we find that common denominator? Oh, I know this is probably the hardest part. People don't like fractions, they don't understand them, and they also have a lot of steps. So, easiest way, ask yourself, do they have the same bottom number? If not, just multiply the bottom numbers together, and that will give you your common denominator. So, for example, I have 3 and 4 as my denominators on 2/3 and 1/4. I can just multiply 3 times 4 and get 12. 12 will be my common denominator. Does this work for every single fraction? Yes. Is it always practical? No. If you have your denominators as 20 and 20, you do not want, or 20 and 21, you don't want like this huge number as your denominator. So, but this is an easy way to get started. Sometimes this means you have really big numbers and you have to simplify later, but it's a place to get started. So step 3, once you've found your common denominator, you need to multiply the numerator by the other fraction's denominator. So in this case, I will multiply both the 2 and the 3 and 2/3 by 4. And then when I do that, I end up with 8/12. And then in 1/4, I will multiply both the 1 and the 4 by 3. And I end up with 3/12. Then you write your final fractions, 8/12 and 3/12, and you may add or subtract whatever they're asking you to do. Let's do some practice with finding the common denominator. So I'm going to show you how to use the multiples to find the least common denominator. So it's always easy if you don't know your multiples to list them out. So for 1/3 and 5/12, I have to look at the multiples of 3. They are 3, 6, 9, 12. Blah, 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 blah. I can stop once I get to 12. The denominator of 12, or sorry, the multiples of 12 are 12 and 24. I can stop there because I can see right now that 12 is something they have in common. That becomes your least common denominator. So then all I have to do is change the 1/3 because 5/12 already has 12 as its denominator. So ask yourself, for 1/3, what do I multiply 3 times to get 12? And that would be 4. So multiply both your top number and your bottom number by 4, and you end up with 4/12. And then, of course, I said you don't have to change 5/12 because it's already got 12 as its denominator. For question number 2, I have 2 and 5. So list your multiples of 2, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. List your multiples of 5, 5, 10, 15, 20. And then I say, okay, what do they have in common? The smallest number they have in common is 10. That becomes your least common denominator. So then how do I get 1/2 as a denominator of 10? I multiply them both by 5, and I end up with 5/10. That one you can kind of figure in your head. What's half of 10? 5. 3/5 To get 10 as my denominator, I multiply them both by 2, and I end up with 6/10. Now I can add, subtract, whatever I need to do. Last example on the first row, I have 2/7 and 2/5. Again, this is one I could list out all my multiples, but they're not going to have anything in common. I'm just going to end up multiplying the 7 times the 5, and 35 is my smallest common denominator. So then I take 2/7 and multiply them both by 5, and I take 2/5 and multiply them both by 7, and I end up with my common fraction or common denominators in my fractions. Here's another row of practice problems. If you want to go ahead and pause the video and try them, you are welcome to, or you can follow along with me if you don't feel you have it yet. For 2/9 and 1/3, I list out my multiples of both 3 and 9, and I can see that 9 is their common denominator. Since 2/9 already has a denominator of 9, I don't have to do anything. But 1/3, I need to multiply them both by 3. So then 1 times 3 is 3, 3 times 3 becomes 9, and I get 3/9. For number 5, list out your multiples of 3, and then list out your multiples of 8, and they don't have anything smaller in common than 24, which is what I get when I multiply them together. So then I take 7/8, multiply them both by 3, and I get 21/24. Take 2/3, multiply both by 8, and you get 16/24, and then you can add, subtract, whatever you need to do. Last example, I would recommend this one because they do have something smaller in common than 40. And if I list out my factors of 10, I have 10 and 20, and then list out your multiples of 4, and I have 4, 8, 12, 16, 20. So, fun fact, if you start with the larger of the two numbers and have an idea in your head of what the smaller numbers multiples are, you can kind of look at the multiples of the larger number and say, okay, will that work? Will that work? Will that work? It's a little less work on your part. So just a hint. In this case, you have 20 as your common denominator, so I would multiply both the 3 and the 10 by 2 to get 20 on the bottom, and I end up with 6/20. For 1/4, I would multiply them both by 5, and I get to 5/20, and then again, add or subtract whatever they want you to do. Okay, now for the backside. We need to review how to simplify. We just came out of our fraction decimal percent unit, and simplifying fractions has been a little tough. So how do you simplify fractions? Find the greatest common factor, the greatest number they have in common, and divide by that number. If you don't know what the greatest common factor is, you can list out the factors and find the greatest one they have in common, or try those common ones like 2, 4, 5, 10, and see if you can divide by those. And 3, sorry, forgot 3. For 4/6, they're both even. I would divide them both by 2, and I end up with 2/3. For 18/21, I can divide those both by 3, because although 18 is even, 21 is not, so 2 won't work. Divide 18 by 3, I get 6. 21 divided by 3 is 7. I end up with 6/7. For question number 3, I have 4 and 16. My greatest common factor is 4. I would divide them both by 4 and get 1/4. And then you guys struggled a little bit when there was a mixed number. When there is a mixed number and you have to simplify the fraction, don't lose the whole number. Okay, that's like losing dollar bills in your pocket. You're going to get really upset. So be careful. That's a problem a lot of students have. So 1 and 3/15, divide them both by 3, and I end up with 1 and 1/5. Don't lose the whole number. All right, we've already worked on this in class. We had some practice problems with this, but let's review it again. To change improper fractions to mixed numbers, you divide the top dog by the bottom dog, just like we did for fraction decimal percents. 22 goes in the house, 4 goes outside the house, and then how many times does 4 go into 22? The answer is 5 times, and when I subtract, I have 2 left over. 5 becomes your whole number, the 2 becomes your new numerator, and 4 remains your denominator. Then you have to simplify. 4 and 2/4 becomes, 5 and 2/4 becomes 5 and 1/2. I did not make a mistake, don't ask me for candy. Another example, 15/3. 15 goes in the house, 3 goes outside the house, 3 goes into 15 exactly 5 times, and I don't have a remainder, so my answer is just 5. For 12/5, 12 goes inside the house, 5 goes outside the house. How many times does 5 fit into 12? The answer is twice. When I subtract, I have 2 left over, so my new numerator is 2, my denominator is 5. You guys pause the video, try these 3 on your own. When you're ready, come back and I'll go over them quickly. Welcome back. So 14/5, 14 goes inside the house, 5 goes outside, 5 goes into 14 2 times with 4 left over, so it becomes 2 4/5. 25 divided by 4, 25 goes in the house, 4 is outside the house, 4 goes into 25 times 6 times with 1 left over, so it becomes 6 1/4. 48 goes inside the house, 7 goes outside the house, 7 goes into 48 6 times, that makes 42. Subtract and you have 6 left over, so I end up with 6 6/7. Look at the very bottom of the backside, and we are going to actually do some practice. So here's the steps for adding and subtracting fractions. Number 1, stack the fractions. Students try to do them horizontally, and then trying to make common denominators, it gets kind of messy. Stack the fractions vertically or on top of each other, then look at the fractions and say, do they have common denominators? If not, you got to find them. We already went over that, so this should be easy. 2/3, 3/4, they both have a common denominator of 12. We went over that earlier. So we multiply them by each other, 2/3 by 4 and 3/4 by 3, and I end up with 8/12 and 9/12. Now I have to add the numerators only. 8 plus 9 is 17/12. But now I've got a top-heavy fraction, an improper fraction. I have to turn it back into a mixed number using the process we just went over. 17 is divided by 12, so 17 goes in the house. 12 goes into 17 1 time, and there's 5 left over. And I can't simplify that any further, so my answer is just 1 5/12. Go ahead and put a square, ding, 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 nugget. Put a square around that answer. Put a square around 1 5/12. Next example is a subtraction one. This time I have a whole number, a mixed number minus a fraction. You still have to find common denominators. Stack your fractions. Ask yourself, do they have common denominators? The answer is no. So this time I'm going to find the least common denominator, which is 30, and it's found by multiplying 5 times 6. So 1 3/5 gets multiplied by 6, 1/6 gets multiplied by 5, and I end up with 1 18/30 on the top, and 5/30 on the bottom. Subtract your fraction first, the numerators of your fraction. 18 minus 5 is 13/30, and then you subtract your whole numbers. And the reason why I say subtract your fractions first, because when you're doing subtraction, you may have to borrow from the whole number. And if you've already subtracted your whole number, it's going to mess you up. So start with your fraction on the right and then move to your whole numbers last. So in this case, 1 minus nothing is just 1. And you end up with 1 13/30, which cannot be simplified, and you are done. And now it's time for you to show what you have learned and what you remember from 5th grade. So log in and take the homework quiz.